What's up, everybody? This is Willie, and today we're talking about Survivor again. And with us now reaching Survivor 50, I think it would be great to look back on the new era seasons and rank them because, quite frankly, this is a very niche sort of subject. So basically, in other words, I'm going to be ranking each new era season from best to worst based on my personal enjoyment with them. So let's get started. So to start at number 9, the worst new era season of Survivor to me is gonna be Survivor 44. Now, to be fair, at the time of its airing, I was liking it for the most part because obviously it stems from the Tika 3 in Jam Jam Carolyn and Carson, and the story surrounding how they maneuver through the game. And yeah, it is satisfying to see an underdog grouping being able to come out on top, but I feel like the way the season has been presented was just done in the most mundane way possible, and I just find myself more detached from when we move away from this season. Like, there's not really a striking moment that this season is exhibiting. Like, yeah, there is a big story surrounding the Tika 3, but when it comes to the gameplay of them all, it's just not interesting to me. Like, yeah, maybe the best tribal might be the first tribal when Maddie goes home, but even then, the way it was just presented was in a way where we're not supposed to care about the Ratu players. Even then, when I was like in the season while it was airing, I felt like I was over-exaggerating that in a way, when in reality, I just felt a bit checked out of the season, since it was very obvious that the Tika 3 were going to make up the final stretch of the game. And what's even more egregious is that when we're centering around the Tika 3, everyone else on the cast just barely has anything to remark on this season. I mean, yeah, there's like Josh, who was at least willing to give conflict, and then we have the Franny and Matt relationship, but then everyone else, I just feel like the likes of like Kane, Brandon, Sarah, like people who got decent screen time, I feel like I forgot even what they did on this season. Like, everything about this season is just not what you would enjoy from any sort of gameplay front whatsoever. And when you only have a limited amount of characters who are great characters in Carolyn and Jam Jam, it's just bad when you realize there's barely anyone else who has that fair share. Like, overall, Survivor 44 was just way too kumbaya of a cast with such dull gameplay, and the story of the Tika 3 just being so shoved in our faces. I just feel like my interest for this season has aged the worst since. So with that, I'm ranking this at number 9. Now jumping to number 8, and it's a season that I think most people are going to expect, especially with how negatively this season was perceived during and after airing, but I feel like my investment into it was at least a bit better than 44, so at number 8, I have Survivor 48, which, yeah, it is pretty easy to assess this as a really bad season, especially with the merge phase where everything just went downhill from there, but the pre-merge was pretty strong. I mean, starting from the Justin boot all the way to the Bianca boot was just non-stop thrill, just stemming from how train-wrecky and chaotic each tribal was, and that goes without saying that they do pertain to a more bigger moments on the season, unlike anything I could say for Survivor 44. And character-wise, I mean, we had Say, who might as well be a stronger reason why it's above 44, as she didn't want to come into this game playing camaraderie, and I'm glad to have a character like her on the show. I like Mary. I did like the Joe and Eva dynamic at that one huge moment, even though their gameplay is not the most riveting in the world. I did also like Kyle and Camilla's dynamic, with the latter being a lot more of a fun, self-doubted player. But then outside of that, yeah, the season does lose its steam when we get to the post-merge, where really with that big alliance with the Straw Males plus Eva, it really stagnized the gameplay. And while we did have at least some strong votes in between, like the David and Shaheen boot, everything else was just such a predictable ride, where even the next time on Survivor previews couldn't hide the fact that the obvious was going to happen. Like, that's already egregious on how sluggish this post-merge was. But I will say, at least the final result with Kyle winning was at least a tad strong, as it wasn't as predictable as it would have been for a Joe win. So I guess that can slightly elevate this on the list, even though it's still not a great season nonetheless. Now we jump into number 7, and it is a season that I did not like at the time of airing, and I still do not have any sort of reverence for. However, I have softened on my opinion on it since then, as I understood that it's not that entirely bad with some of its quality, and that season is Survivor 43, which, yeah, I know a lot of Survivor Twitter don't really like this season, and I have a fair share of that. This season wasn't like the most interesting in the world, where it really only has that one big moment in the Cody blind side, which I believe is the season's saving grace, because otherwise everything else around the season is just very standardized. Like, it's not entirely bad or anything. While the boot order, I know there's a lot of negativity surrounding it, I was still at least interested to see how the season was going, but it was not like to the level where I was like feeling a strong connection to it, but I still had some level of investment, but still not enough for me to actually look at this as a good season, because I still come out of it being very low, and the Gambler win at the time did really tank my opinions on it further, because I was just not a Gambler fan. But over time, I've begrudgingly softened on it, since I don't think Cassidy is a good player either. Like, all the finalists just suck, which leads to this very train wrecky result. Also doesn't really culminate the season in a satisfying way. So yeah, Survivor 43, a season that I didn't like at the time, but I have grown over my immense hate on it to a tad degree, but it's still a season that lacked a charm of riveting gameplay, with the Cody Tribal being the season's biggest backbone to glean off of from this season. So with that, I think it's best to put season 43 at number 7. Now to number 6, and number 6 here is a season that I was probably the most checked out by, and I think it's clear to me that it is Survivor 49. Like, generally, this is the season I had the most indifference with because I just simply didn't really connect myself to the season as much or care enough what was going on. And I have that fair share with a lot of fellow Survivor YouTubers who had such immense apathy for the season too. And overall, despite it being at least not the worst in the world, it also is pretty middling for the most part, but I still can talk about the pros of this season, where we got that Savannah, Rizzo, and Sophie underdog alliance, which was very interesting to see how they were maneuvering. And while it was kind of foreshown similarly like a Tika Dree situation, at least they were a lot more fluid, and there were actually some bigger moments that happened this season with like the Jawan blindside, the Shan boot I can recall, and I guess I can talk about the Jake medevac, which was just an insane sequence. But other than that, the season is just kind of plain for me, and I think it might hold a bit better on a rewatch. Another thing to take into account is that people who were aware of the 50 cast knew the players from this season that were returning, so it kind of like took away a lot of the suspense with this season because of our knowledge in advance of the players who were coming back. So that made me harming from the experience watching it live, but there is a probable chance that on a rewatch it may hold a bit better. So while I was the most checked out of this season by a lot, I think there is still some merit to it, and I just like the conclusion of the season much better than the previous season, so I think the middle is where it's probably the most feasible to place this season. Now to number 5, and this is a season that I know people like rank it at like their top 10s and stuff, which, I mean, I do like it for the most part, but there are some things that I think leaves me qualms with. So at this ranking, I'm gonna have Survivor 42, which, yeah, I know it's a season that probably is really stronger for the most part with some balanced editing and a decently stronger cast. I mean, some big moments like the Jenny Tribal and the Omar boot, like they are insane when you think about it. I think Marianne is a great character and great casting choice, especially with her winning being a great satisfying conclusion to this season. Now with that said, this season is not with its down point, with obviously the middle stretch being a major example of that, where the gameplay was a bit of a drag with some just predictable boots and me just not caring for the most part. But after, let's just say, the Tori boot, everything started getting more interesting again with some of the bigger players getting taken out back to back to back. So there is some strong rebounding the season has in its back third, but everything else, outside of the Jenny Tribal leading up to it, it was just hit or miss. Like, I know this season is well revered by most people. I'm on par with that in a way, but over time, I've just been recognizing that this season does partially lose a lot of its footing in its middle stretch, which made me pretty disliking of it. So with that, Survivor 42 is at number 5. Now to number 4, and this may be the most controversial take based on how I see the general fan base often ranks this season, but I just feel like I have a lot more reverence for this season despite its blatant issues, and that season is Survivor 41, which, okay, yeah, I see a lot of people on social media would label this as like the worst New Era season, or even possibly try and label this as the worst season in general, which I know you're right for ranking, but I think you're pretty absurd if you look at it that way. And in a lot of fashion, I do think fans are just being very disingenuous with themselves with ranking this season. So anyways, this season is obviously the first New Era season, and obviously it has to take a lot of the bulk of introducing its mechanics, which takes away a lot of screen time from the players, and that alone is really bad, on par with his really bad editing that made Erica so non-existent in the pre-merge. And obviously that merge round with the Hourglass was just probably the epitome of the big BS with these New Era rules. Once we move past that, the season does pop for a lot, where we have some really strong dynamics and some really big blindsides like the Sydney and Shan tribals, which I really enjoy watching it live. And Erica winning is something that I was so happy to see despite her bad edit. And while I can get a lot of people were underwhelmed with her winning, believe me, she did nothing. When it's like, do your homework and listen to some exit interviews, then you'd probably understand Erica's a better player than how she was portrayed. Like, for me, this season is one that I hold to personal high regard, much more than how the usual fan base would look at it. And I think the pacing was solid enough, with just that big stinker being the obvious Hourglass episode. So yeah, a solidly paced season, but with some really bad editing and some obvious BS twists to be thrown in. That leaves me reserved to put it at the top, but I think number 4 is the best to put it at, especially since the seasons following are all pertaining to the 90-minute format. So I think it's best to lead the season at that. Now at number 3, and this is a season that I know is really popular, and I understand that as well, but for me, I feel like my experience watching it live was just not as interesting in my point of view, and that season is Survivor 45, which I know is not going to be a popular take, but I think from my personal experience, I was not really feeling as invested into the season as much, but I still was interested every week for what's to come, especially with some really big moments like the Sabai Tribal, Kelly blindside, Julie idling out Emily under Dee's commands. Like, there can be a lot to really gauge off of this season, as well as the fact that I think Dee plays probably the most dominant game of the New Era winners, which may be a bit of a spoiler on who probably would be number one if I did make a New Era winner ranking. But genuinely, it is a really solid ride throughout. But I think my lesson in essence stemmed from the Reba 4 kind of like taking the steering wheel a bit too much, which to the point where we had rounds where it was pretty foreshown who would be going home, and that was obviously kind of bad. But the season is really good on pace as a whole, and I also think because it was the first season experimenting the 90-minute format, it really goes to show that 90 minutes is really worth for Survivor, especially when we get more screen time with players and actually understand their games more. And I think the cast is really solid. Like, we got Dee, Julie, Emily, I like pre-mergers like Sabaya, Brandon in a way. Like, this cast does deliver for the most part. I think it's just that tad bit that kind of lost on my attachment to this season, as well as the fact that I just think the other seasons went my way a bit more. So with that, I am going to have Survivor 45 here at number 3. Now at number 2, and this season, I know it's somewhat mixed by most of the fan base, but I always put it on a more higher spectrum on a ranking, so with that, I have Survivor 46, which I know has a really bad pre-merge. I mean, from the Jess boot all the way to Bondu's eventual elimination, it was just a very stagnant stretch, which, watching it live, yeah, it's not a good experience. However, I still think this season did pick up afterwards. I mean, even from the start, we had the Jelinski blindside, which I always believe had a really strong bang to the season, and then we got the post-merge, where starting from the soda boot onwards, it was just chaos, and a lot of that is because of Q being the central figure of the chaos surrounding this season, and he's ultimately probably one of the best New Era casting choices in quite a while. But that doesn't take away the fact that we got some other great characters like Venus, Tiffany, Kenzie in a way, and we had some interesting dynamic like the one between Maria and Charlie, and that all culminated in a very big tragedy with Maria's vote costing Charlie the win. Yeah, from a gameplay perspective, obviously not the greatest win in the world. However, from the entertainment lens, it is brilliant and is what kept me invested into the season as we go along. Now, what makes us not crack the number 1 spot is the obvious downer in the premiers, like I said. So that holds the season back a bit, but overall, I really did enjoy it, and this is where it lands at number 2. So then ranked at the top, the number 1 season of the New Era for me is Survivor 47. Like, this season was competent throughout in its entirety. Like, I found myself invested a lot into this season, even prior to the preseason, as the cast Redmond put out was the most exciting I have been since 41, which kind of shows you the fundamental flaws with the New Era casting in that it got a little repetitive. But this season's cast felt a bit more special and exciting coming into it, and while not really much of them popped from, at least we still got some really solid casting choices like Andy, Rachel, Sue, Genevieve, Caroline. Like, there's a lot I can name from this cast to have at least something to bring to the table from a more gameplay standpoint. And this is the thing, it's like, this cast felt like the most game body possible, so that's why a lot of my enjoyment from this season is from a gameplay standpoint. Now, truthfully, does it have a bit of its slow points? Yes, in a way. We had like boots like the Kyle boot and the Tiana boot that were just not really the greatest in the world, but aside from those, the other episodes were at least solid enough with some really decent vote outs in my eyes. And while Rachel does kind of underwhelm me with her winning game, I was still excited to see her win this season, as what else would Survivor 47 been without Rachel? And taking into account some of the bigger moments this season, we had like the Keyshawn blindside, which Genevieve orchestrated. We obviously have Rome, where while I don't really like his antics, I do think he really brought a villain energy that was sort of missed in the modern season. While we just had Q on the last season, I still think Rome was able to reinforce the villain mold. So likewise, while the season doesn't really pop from a character standpoint, I still really loved the journey throughout, which is why it lived up to the hype coming into the season. So with that, Survivor 47 ends up being my personal favorite New Era season of Survivor. But that's my list, how I would personally rank all the New Era seasons based on my personal enjoyment with them. With that, that wraps up the video for you guys. And likewise, I'm probably also going to do a New Era winner ranking soon, so hopefully can get that out before my Survivor 50 review. So with that, appreciate the tune in, guys. See you later.